Hi, this is Dave Kahle, and welcome to our Practical Wisdom podcast. This is designed for sales professionals and business executives, and hopefully, we bring you wisdom and insights to help you sell better, lead better, and live better. Hi, this is Dave, and I'm afraid for the future of our country. It's not just COVID-19 and the reaction to it. And it's not just the riots and the looting. It's deeper than that. I'm afraid because I believe that the discipline of thinking before we act in every circumstance and every level of society is rapidly disappearing. And in its place, we're witnessing a whole host of alternatives. It's like thousands of years of human development have been shrugged to the side, and a new ethic of rushing to conclusions with little objective basis has replaced it. We're regressing to the Middle Ages. It permeates society at every level. The most visible non-thinker are those who we would expect to be solidly committed to rational thought, and that would be the national politicians in Washington. The idea of calmly considering evidence from both sides of an issue and then making a thoughtful decision, evidently that's a concept that just has no currency in our sadly partisan environment. We would expect mature, educated men and women whom we have elected to represent us, we would expect them to bring their best thinking to their decision-making. Instead, we see instance after instance of decisions being made in a mode that is the opposite of what they should be. Instead of rationally and calmly assessing the facts, they proceed with a predetermined conclusion based on an emotional agenda. The process of good governance has been knocked back hundreds of years. Actions based on emotional reasons, devoid of any pretense of intellectual discipline, have been the cause of countless instances of human suffering and injustice. Think of the millions of Hitler Youth, for example, where the emotional pressure to go along with the masses, that was strong enough to bury rational thought. Did one become a Ku Klux Klan member, for example, because of rational thought or because it felt good? And look at the disaster in Venezuela as another example. Is there some rational defense of socialism somewhere in its background? Or did this whole disaster come from an emotional payback for a power-hungry politician? Were they more interested in power than they were rational thought and good decision-making? I suspect so. Where's the intellectual leader of the Antifa phenomenon, for example? Or is that another instance of emotional payback supporting actions which cannot be defended rationally? And then, of course, there's the thousands of college students who demand, quote, safe places, end quote, because they're not intellectually stout enough to withstand someone questioning their position. They've put the cause of higher education back hundreds of years. It's an example of confirmation bias on steroids. And probably the most influential offenders of a lack of rational thinking are the people who we used to call journalists, who now have become apologists, and have in mass and wholeheartedly deserted the idea of objective news reporting, and they've replaced it with selective, agenda-driven sound bites. It seems like everywhere we look, we see people who ought to be operating rationally and thoughtfully. Instead, they're being swept along in a wave of follow the crowd and emotional motivation. It does not portend well for us individually or for us as a society. When we make decisions on the basis that it feels good, when our rational mind is telling us to slow down and be wary, it almost always turns into a disaster. We end up taking the wrong job and we suffer for months in the wrong environment. We find ourselves with the wrong people. We buy the wrong car. We live in the wrong place. Sooner or later, most of us realize the mistake we made and then we work to change it. But the cost Oh, the cost has been lots of time wasted, relationships damaged, and emotions exhausted. Learning to make decisions rationally and not be driven by emotional motivations is often part of the rite of passage to adulthood. You haven't grown up until you bridge that chasm. Unfortunately, too many people in our country have never made that transition and remain intellectually stunted well into their adult years. You know, the philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, quote, "Most people would rather die than think. In fact, they do." As our society wanders further away from rational thought, the pressures from the media, the educational establishment, and the political arena have made the transition for immature, emotionally driven decisions to mature, rational decisions. They've made that decision seem less desirable. The public arena offers fewer and fewer rational role models. And unfortunately, when we lose the connection to rational thought, we regress as a society to a less civilized culture. Rational thought and the rule of law are bedrock principles that lift a society out of the arbitrary and capricious to a system that promotes justice and fairness to all. And as a society, we don't have to look very deeply into history to see the disastrous consequences of the lack of rational thought. It opens the door to mob rule, almost always unjustly persecutes a few. Think of the Middle Ages, or in our history. Think of the infamous Salem witch trials, mob rule, emotional decision-making, and a few are unjustly persecuted. One of the dangers of emotionally driven behavior has to do with the potential turnaround of consequences. So, just in the last few years, the Kavanaugh nomination was a great example. The media and the political left promoted discarding the rule of law. It took hundreds of years of precedent to build up a rule of law that says we listen to evidence and someone is not guilty till proven guilty. That's the media and the political left promoted discarding that. Why? Because it didn't suit their pre-existing agenda. Every female acquisition should be believed, they said, regardless of the evidence, they claimed. Until the tables turned when Biden became the topic of a similar charge. See, once you abandon rational thought, once you abandon the rule of law, once you abandon the things that we've learned over the years, once you abandon that in favor of mob rule, you stand the very real possibility that it could turn on you. Anarchy is great until it's your business that's attacked and burned. Mob rule is energizing until it's your family member that's injured or killed. Agenda-driven actions feel good until the situation turns on you and you become the victim. And by then, it's too late. Actions taken in a wave of emotion and following the crowd almost always bring about unintended consequences and the guilt and regret that follows. As a civilization, we have lifted ourselves out of the Middle Ages, and it is incredibly sad to see us regress. That's it. I'm done. Bye-bye.